A warm welcome to everyone here. I feared that with all the snow we had yesterday, no one would show. And I'd like to welcome especially you lovers of Jane Austen, whose achievement we are celebrating this afternoon. Today, some 201 years after her untimely death at age 41, she, like President Kennedy, seems to have suffered from Addison's disease. Today, Austen's literary reputation has never been greater. She is regarded as one of our finest novelists, so much so that some very smart scholars dare to mention her name in the same breath with Shakespeare. And today, the major romanticists at Harvard, Johns Hopkins, Florida, Colorado, Arizona State, and the list goes on and on, are Austen scholars. It has not always been so. When I was hired here at Providence College some 33 years ago, my former colleague, Julia Brown, had just been denied tenure at Boston University, in spite of having written an award-winning first book, receiving unanimous support from her department and dean, and sporting an impeccable teaching record. And why was she denied tenure? Because, and I am not making this up, her book was a study of Jane Austen. Austen, said Boston University's president, wasn't a serious scholarly subject. Austen just wasn't in the same league with John Dryden, he said. And he said it under oath in a court of law. And why was he in court saying dumb things like that? Because Professor Brown had sued him and his university, and John Silber's sworn testimony was the primary reason she won her case. Austen has come a long way since the late 1980s, and that is a very good thing. A sign of just how far she has come can be seen here in our Arts and Sciences window. Jane Austen is our representative literary artist, with Chawton House, where she lived and which now has been turned into a magnificent library and study center focused on Austen and women writers, is depicted just above her. There she is, with Mozart on her right and Darwin on her left, taking her place with supreme geniuses as the supreme genius that she was. I am good friends with the leading scholarly expert on Austen reception, Devaney Loser of Arizona State. And two of my former students have actually gone on to do graduate study with her. Loser tells me that to the best of her knowledge, this is the only stained glass image of Jane Austen in the world. And I am told on very good authority that our president, Father Brian Shanley, a much wiser man than his former counterpart at BU, personally chose Austen to be the representative literary artist. I invited Father Shanley to be with us today, but alas, he had a prior commitment. Even so, I think he deserves a warm round of applause for his wisdom and fine literary taste. And one more thing you may notice in the Austen window if you look closely enough. In the drapery above her head are the initials CMJ. These are not the artist's initials. Sylvia Nicholas, the brilliant stained glass artist who designed this beautiful window, put her signature there in the Martin Luther King window. Nor are they the initials of the donors, Michael J. and Jane Joyce. Rather, they are the initials of the Joyce's daughter, Carolyn, who, because she suffers from a serious neurological disorder, will never be able to attend Providence College or any other school of higher learning. According to the Joyces, they asked that Carolyn's initials be placed in the Jane Austen window, both as an honor to Austen and to give their daughter a permanent place in the history of the college. Jane Austen, I think, would be pleased. But to the matter at hand. In December 1817, some 5 months after her death, and just in time for the Christmas book trade, Jane Austen's last 2 novels were published in a 4-volume set dated 1818. Volumes 1 and 2 contained Northanger Abbey, a novel she had finished 16 years earlier and sold to a publisher who, for inexplicable reasons, never published it. Volumes 3 and 4 contained Persuasion, the novel she finished on her deathbed just before writing became impossible. It is the 200th anniversary of the publication of that novel that is the primary occasion for my talk today. Persuasion is unusual in the Austen canon. Her heroine, Anne Eliot, is not a young woman falling in love for the first time. She's 27 years old, on the verge of what they then called spinsterhood. Nor is she, like Elizabeth Bennet of Pride and Prejudice, her father's favorite. Rather, her father, Sir Walter Elliot Baronet, barely notices her and never heeds her. Austen calls him silly and vain, which he certainly is, and Anne certainly is not. And to make matters worse, Sir Walter has outspent his income for years and is being forced to rent out his inherited estate, Kellynch Hall, and take up lodgings in the resort town of Bath. Love plot? Well, that's unusual too. In 1806, 8 years before the action of the novel takes place, Anne had been engaged to a young naval officer, Captain Frederick Wentworth, brother of a local clergyman, and a man her father did not approve of because, well, he simply wasn't of the Elliot social class. And so Anne, facing rejection from her father and disapproval from her friends, was persuaded by her neighbor, Lady Russell, to break things off between them in spite of their passionate attachment. There is no other Austen novel that has this kind of story lurking in the background. And we are told of the emotional and physical effects the broken engagement has had on Anne Elliot. She has lost her bloom, we are told, and other than her books and her nephews and her reading of newspapers and Navy lists to learn of Wentworth's whereabouts, her life doesn't seem to have much point. Then Wentworth comes back. The brother-in-law of Admiral Croft, Rear Admiral of the White, Anne tells us, and it is Admiral Croft who has the resources to rent Kellynch Hall from the Elliots. And here I need to pause and say something about the dating of the action of this novel. We can date it precisely, something which also makes it unique among Austen's work. Why was a young Navy officer courting a young woman in 1806? Because after the defeat of the French Navy at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, he had extended shore leave. Why are Admiral Croft and Captain Wentworth, not to mention Captain Benwick, all back in rural Somerset in the last half of 1814 looking for a place to live, and in the case of Wentworth and Benwick, young women to marry? Because Napoleon had been captured and sent into exile in Elba, and the long 21-year war with France seemed finally at an end. So the plot, from the moment of Wentworth's return, turns out to be fairly straightforward. Will Wentworth marry a sweet young vacuous thing like Louisa Musgrove, or will he realize again his attachment to Anne? Will Anne be able to prove to him that she is still the capable young woman he fell in love with, or is their love irrevocably past? Well, it's an Austen novel, so you can guess the outcome. But I did want to give this brief plot summary for those of you unfamiliar with Persuasion and those of you who read it long ago. So with that little summary, let me turn to my paper, Austen's Odyssey. Just over a century ago, Samuel Butler published one of the oddest contributions to Homeric criticism ever written, a book called The Authoress of the Odyssey, Where and When She Wrote, Who She Was, and the Use She Made of the Iliad, and How the Poem Grew Under Her Hands. As supporting evidence for female authorship, Butler cited, among other things, the gender of the shades Odysseus meets in his journey to Hades. A male writer, he claims, would have begun with kings or great warriors or poets, not with brides or, heaven help us, the hero's mother, who is herself immediately followed by all the wives and daughters of great princes. No self-respecting man could imagine such a thing. In the Odyssey, Butler concluded, we are in the hands not of a man, but of a woman. Then he added a curious qualifier. If he found himself in the underworld and able to choose the shades he might meet, he would include 3 women: Sappho, Jane Austen, and the authoress of the Odyssey. Though he would, of course, want to meet Schubert and Handel and Shakespeare and Arcangelo Corelli and a host of other males first. Now, I'm not sure what this statement tells us about Austen's reception history, but it does call attention to a question that Austen herself raised in the penultimate chapter of Persuasion. Men have had every advantage of us in telling their own story, protests Anne Eliot. The pen has been in their hands. Or, put somewhat differently, what would a story like the Odyssey look like if it really were told by a woman from the point of view of her own range of experience? As both Mary DeForest and William Dershowitz have noted, that may be exactly what Austen was attempting in Persuasion. In an essay on classical allusions in Austen, DeForest suggested that Persuasion might be seen as a Penelopead, with Anne Eliot as Penelope and Frederick Wentworth as Odysseus, and she called attention to a handful of parallels between the two works, some convincing, such as the 8-year separation of Wentworth and Anne, and others less so. She compares Louisa Musgrove to Nausicaa. Dershowitz, in the middle of his discussion of the debts of persuasion to Sir Walter Scott, similarly remarked that Anne plays the role of Penelope, while Wentworth is her warrior and sailor who returns from across the sea, with an important difference. She is the one who is changed beyond recognition, while he is beset by suitors. Dershowitz implicitly compares Louisa Musgrove to Antinous. Austen's sailors, he concluded, are sea fighters, warriors, and wanderers at once, and they unite the Iliad of the heroism of the Iliad and the Odyssey. With these observations made more or less in passing in mind, I would like today to consider more broadly the ways in which Austen is invoking the Homeric epic in Persuasion. That she is doing so seems obvious once you say it. Count the chapters. 12 in Volume 1, 12 in Volume 2, both of them the number of books in the Aeneid, for a total of 24, which is, of course, the number of books in the Homeric epics. No other Austen novel is organized like this. The war with France, like the war with Troy, is the occasion of Anne and Wentworth's separation, a separation that would have certainly occurred whether they had married or not. And the separation and uncertainty caused by war would have been, in my mind at least, a more persuasive argument against marriage than the ones Lady Russell used to convince her. There is even, as Dershowitz remarked, a Penelope, the ironically named Mrs. Clay, who spends most of the novel on the make for one eligible widower or another. If there is an Odyssean evil suitor in Persuasion, it is not Louisa or Henrietta Musgrove or even William Walter Elliot. It is Penelope Clay. I'll return to Mrs. Clay in a moment, but first I need to turn my attention to Anne Eliot, the supposed Homeric Penelope of the novel. One thing is very clear. Anne Eliot spent the years of the Napoleonic Wars very differently from her Homeric original. There were no hordes of suitors camped out at Kellynch Hall, only Charles Musgrove, whose perfunctory proposal was easy to reject, and who promptly moved on and proposed to her younger sister Mary. With no suitors to reject, there is no need for her to invent elaborate schemes to ward them off. So there is no equivalent to Penelope's web, woven in the day and unwoven at night, one of literature's most famous stratagems of delay. In fact, other than the weaving, we know very little of what Homer's Penelope did during her husband's absence. And she, of course, knew nothing of him at all. But in the England of the Napoleonic Wars, things have changed. Anne Eliot knows exactly where Frederick Wentworth has been and what he has done, thanks to her obsessive reading of newspapers, and especially the Navy lists, reading so obsessive that she can even state without a moment's hesitation the precise rank of Wentworth's brother-in-law, Admiral Croft. Wentworth, on the other hand, knows as little of Anne as Odysseus does of Penelope, partly by choice and partly because no newspaper would bother to report on the domestic doings of a country baronet's daughter. Even if, like Sir Walter Eliot, he owned and read the baronetage, which of course he doesn't, all he could learn of her was her birthday. And then there's the matter of property. Penelope is in charge of the family property and custodian of it pending her husband's return. And Eliot, on the other hand, is in no such position at Kellynch Hall. In fact, she watches the family property waste away due to her father's vanity and extravagance. If the decadence of Penelope's suitors is caused by the king's absence, an absence due to his obligation to go to war, the decadence in rural Somersetshire results from the negligence of an aristocratic class that rests on its past achievements and ignores altogether its obligations to the nation at large. That decadence is corrected in this novel by a generation of successful military men like Admiral Croft and Captain Wentworth and even Captain Benwick, as distinguished in their domestic virtues as in their national importance, as Austen's narrator puts it, and many of them likely to become in time baronets themselves. The climactic recognition scene in the two works need particular attention. In the Odyssey, Odysseus reveals himself to Penelope in Book 23, and the two are reconciled. Similarly, and not, I believe, coincidentally, it is in the 23rd chapter of Persuasion that the reconciliation scene occurs between Anne Eliot and Captain Wentworth. In the Greek epic, it is Penelope who must be convinced of Odysseus's identity, and the test of the marriage bed that she contrives on the spot, however improbable it has seemed to literal-minded commentators, is one of the great symbolic statements we have about the importance of marital fidelity to the Homeric oikos. The bedchamber is at the center of the house. The bed itself is built from a living olive tree that Odysseus trimmed and fashioned into a bed leg, and it is still rooted in the ground and cannot be moved. In Persuasion, of course, it is Wentworth that must be convinced of Anne Eliot's constancy, in a scene that must have given Austen some trouble, as the original manuscript version is strikingly different from what was published after her death. In the rejected manuscript ending, Wentworth and Anne are left alone at the Crofts' lodgings in Bath, and her denial of an engagement to William Eliot is enough to confirm her love to Wentworth. "Anne, my own dear Anne," Wentworth exclaims. They were reunited. Austen almost laconically concludes. Published version is more complicated. There, Austen constructs a theatrical scene with Captain Harville and Anne at center stage discussing the comparative constancy of men and women, while Wentworth sits in the shadows, overhearing everything they say and occasionally dropping his pen in astonishment. Both comment on literary representations of lovers, and Harville's account of the feelings of a sailor when he leaves home and when he returns may even echo Odysseus's lamentations to Calypso in Odyssey, Book 5. If I could but make you comprehend what a man suffers when he takes a last look at his wife and children, and then turns away and said, God knows whether we ever meet again. And then if I could convey to you the glow of his soul when he does see them again, if I could explain to you all this and all that a man can bear and do and glories to do for the sake of these treasures of his existence, says Harville. Anne's protestation of fidelity, made in the third person about women generally, at last break down the barriers between the two lovers, and they live happily ever after, or at least until Napoleon escapes from Elba and the Battle of Waterloo ensues, an historical fact that all Austen's readers knew would happen, but that Austen herself deliberately elides. If I'm right about the allusions to the Odyssey, by the way, Austen has added here another dimension to the discussion of constancy. For however much Odysseus may have pined for home, he has not exactly been celibate. 7 years, every night, sharing Calypso's bed, and a year with Circe. Austen calls attention to a double standard of sexual fidelity, that while it may not be an issue for a good Wilberforcian naval officer like Captains Harville and Wentworth and Admiral Croft, it's nonetheless gestured at in the affairs of their friend Captain Benwick. It is Benwick's sudden engagement to Louisa Musgrove that generates the discussion about constancy. Benwick, who was still in mourning for his deceased fiancée, Fanny Harville, finds it really easy to propose to Louisa. Poor Fanny, laments her brother, Captain Harville. She would not have forgotten him so soon. Fidelity is one thing for Odysseus and another for Penelope, as it is one thing for Benwick and another for Fanny Harville. The remarkable thing about Frederick Wentworth is that he can write without a shadow of hypocrisy, I have loved none but you. Unjust I may have been, weak and resentful I have been, but never inconstant. But if Anne Elliot is modeled in part after Penelope, she is also modeled after Penelope's son, Telemachus. Like Telemachus, she has been forced to witness the wasting away of her family estate, with the ironic difference that it is her father and elder sister that are the wastrels, not irresponsible suitors. And like Telemachus, she watches her father and elder sister's thoughtless extravagance in quiet helplessness, since, as we are told several times, neither of them pays attention to her or her advice, even when she warns them about Penelope Clay and her machinations, a situation that also reflects the suitor's disregard for Odysseus' son. Telemachus, with Athena's direction, secretly departs from Ithaca so that he can discover news of his father at the courts of Menelaus and Nestor. Anne's travels to Uppercross and Lyme Regis and finally Bath are not to seek information. She is well aware of the exploits of Captain Wentworth due to her knowledge of the Navy lists. Rather, her state travels are stages of discovery. In Uppercross, the dizziness she feels in Wentworth's accidental embrace discloses to her the depth of her feelings for him. At Lyme Regis, when Louisa Musgrove falls from the cob and is knocked unconscious, Wentworth sees firsthand Anne's self-command and her ability to act decisively under stress. At Bath, Wentworth's jealousy of William Eliot affirms to Anne that he still might love her. After his return to Ithaca, Telemachus grows up. He resists the suitors, plays a crucial role in their slaughter, and in so doing puts on the heroic manhood of his father. Anne, by contrast, youthens. Her lost bloom is restored, and she experiences a second spring of youth and beauty, as Austen puts it. Wentworth recognizes her as the woman he has always loved, and Anne, who resembles no one so much as her mother, manages to marry a much more admirable man than the vain and silly baronet, Sir Walter Eliot. Where does all this lead? Many have noted that Persuasion is the most historically specific of Austen's novels. Wentworth meets Anne in 1806, shortly after the Battle of Trafalgar. The action of the novel takes place in 1814 and 15, when Napoleon's exile on the island of Elba made it possible for naval officers to return to England and look to settle down. It is not far-fetched to suggest that with Sir Walter Scott's first historical novel, Waverley, in front of her, Waverley was published in 1814, Austen set out to write her own historical novel, one that, like Scott's, chronicled in the lives of ordinary people the dramatic shifts in the social fabric, in this case, the supersession of a decadent aristocracy by a new generation of capable men and women, empowered and enriched by world historical events. Persuasion, then, is her answer to Scott's new fictional genre, the historical novel. But it is also not far-fetched to suggest that Austen also had Homeric epic in mind, and that she would, through Anne Eliot, tell the story of a woman's experience of war, and to suggest by so doing that her story is as interesting and valuable as heroic exploits in battle. This too, as Milton might say, is heroic argument. Or maybe your intentions were not quite so grandiose. Maybe somewhere in the back of her mind was one of her favorite English novelists, the author who called one of his works a comic epic in poem and prose, and another a prosaic comic epic, and structured his greatest novel to reflect the plot line of the Odyssey, referring to Henry Fielding and to his two comic novels, Joseph Andrews and Tom Jones. But more probably it is all of these at once. As she suffered through her fatal illness, Austen wanted to place herself squarely in what we used to call the great tradition, one dominated by those who held the pen in their hands, and to show that she could do it too, and do it her way. Thanks. The early 17th century. Well, she could have read Pope, but Cooper was her favorite author, and William Cooper had just, in the early 1790s, translated both the Eliot and the Odyssey. And so I would suspect that if she read them in Cooper's translation, which is, by the way, far more accurate than Pope. Honey. I have some, but of course it's not complete. At Chawton, they've got a lot of the books that survive. Not that I know of, but, you know, I mean, her father taught school, boys, and I'm pretty sure that those stories were circulating through the house. And she had all those brothers. Came admirals. Go ahead, Chris. We have to wait for a student after you. Up verbal echoes because. I mean, she didn't know Greek, but, you know. Well, you have to remember that the Austen family did private theatricals regularly. Those kinds of characters would have circulated, cycled through in all of those works that they were reading aloud and producing in their family. So it's you know, I can't go through, the letters that survive don't have a whole lot of that kind of thing in it, but You look at, for example, children's books of the period where they will have, and what I mean by children's books is these will be like collections or anthologies of poems for recitation. They almost always, and these would be for boys, they almost always will have long. But I mean, she lived among boys who went to college. Mother who'd been to Oxford. Questions? Need one from a student. Bailey, you must have one. That's a very good question. What year are you? Might happen your senior year. Can't happen next year. We've got too many seminars being. Kate Dickens with Bridgham, she's doing that. Chard's doing Whitman Dickinson again. Other questions? Yeah. For those of you who don't know, I share an establishment with this lady back here. Yes, Margaret. Yeah. Oh, God. Up. I might have even read that once, maybe 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. Especially the way she rewrote it, because if you read the manuscript, the rejected manuscript for ending, it's pretty flat, to tell you the truth. And you kind of look at it and go, gosh, I'm glad you rewrote this. But the way she rewrote it is it's really neat, particularly with the overhearing that balances the overhearing with the hazelnut episode in volume 1. That idea, in fact, the overhearing is so important because, the novel is all pretty much about how people don't really know how other people feel. It's one of the most interior of her novels. And how do you know affection when you've got two people who don't want to talk about it and who can't talk about it because of their past experiences? And so the overhearing becomes, a crucial method of communication. But she and Harville were sitting there trying to talk soft, apparently, but I don't think they were talking that soft. They got pretty wound up in their little debate about things. We read it all aloud in class the other day. I don't see how, with any kind of sense of emotion, you could keep hushed through much of that discussion. Well, I'm not sure. Yeah, that's another thing, too. It looks like she's not intending. 'Cause, 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 Other questions? Yeah, Aaron. Well, there are those two critics. One was something done about 1986 or something like that. And she kind of tacks a little bit on about persuasion at the end. She's got a bunch of things. I don't think a lot of her parallels make a lot of sense, but her stuff on the persuasion, which goes on for about a page or two, is, it confirmed, thinking. I actually went and tried to find stuff about this because this occurred to me in class one day when I asked the class, by the way, how many chapters are there in book 1? And then I realized. And then book 2, oh no, that's 24. That can't be accidental. Wait, there's a Penelope running around. Wait, there's a captain who's been away at war, And it kind of, everything kind of fell into place. So I had to go back and look for the criticism. But the only thing I found was the divorce piece and then a little throwaway bit in the middle of William Dershowitz's book on Jane Austen. Michael, how are you, Michael? Good to see you. Oh no, it was circa like 2004, 3. Yeah, it was. Well, I was still working it out. Did we do Persuasion and Romanticism that year? What do you know? Oh, Mrs. Clay. Yeah, her. Joke. She's a joke. She's a reason. She's cunning. She's playing for Sir Walter, and but then when it doesn't look like Sir Walter has that much money, she goes in after the actual heir. But of course, and that works out at least to his satisfaction because they don't actually end up getting married. She just winds up as his captain. She's just a kind of pathetic character, quite frankly. Especially in the world of Jane Austen. Yeah, Michael. I don't think so. I mean, I don't think that she's going to carry it that far. Austen has pretty strong feelings about the Navy. The Navy, particularly after the Wilberforce in the 90s, reformed it so that you had these fine young men like Captain Harville, and they were trying really to recruit Christian gentlemen as opposed to old salts. And Austen's two brothers, of course, were part of that recruitment process, and of course you had the war with France. Now, the Navy was a much better way to make your fortune because essentially they operated as privateers or pirates. You went out and you captured a French ship, and you got a certain percentage of the booty, and the crown got a certain percentage, and the rest you split among your crew. So it was a good way to make yourself rich, but it was also supposedly more of a gentleman's occupation than foot soldiers. And besides, foot soldiers would be camped out in all kinds of places, and they would have the whorehouses growing up around their camps, and then you'd have little, Bennett girls showing up and getting impressed with their red coats, and then, Wickham carrying them off to wherever, or promised to carry them off to Gretna Green and not get there. Yes. Not recall. I wouldn't call any of it like that. I mean, I thought about that, and I thought, no, that would be a really dumb force. There's nothing in the novel that... Yes. Yes. '70s, that was kind of a hard thing to do. That was what Julia Brown came, more accepted in more places. You had Margaret Homans getting tenure at Yale with a women's office. But also from a popular point of view. Colin Firth film, but you also had Clueless. You also had a very good Persuasion, although the ending is really weird. Persuasion film sails off with Wentworth on his ship to go fight the French again, turning herself into Mrs. Croft. But I do think the films had a lot to do with it as well, particularly in the popular imagination. But there's always been these Austen clubs. And look at a really nice book, award-winning book of criticism that's actually selling thousands of copies, which doesn't happen to books of literary criticism very often. But Devaney Loeser's book, The Making of Jane Austen, traces the history of her reputation and how it grew and how it kind of exploded. One of the interesting things is that Austen was very, very popular among women's reading clubs in small towns in central Indiana and Ohio, particularly the Helen Hunt Club, which was founded in Dayton, and which my grandmother was the president of, in Cambridge City, Indiana, in the 1940s and 50s. And these women keep records of what they read. I mean, really, detailed records of what they read. And you can go look these folks up. You can find the minutes of their meetings online. And again, a lot of them are reading Jane Austen. Yeah, Bailey. Yeah, it's almost as if Eleanor in Sense and Sensibility didn't manage to get married and is now 27. I've heard a very fine Austen scholar, Mark, how pleased she was that she let Anne get her man. But I don't really. I mean, she tries to do different things, side by side. Lizzie Bennet is very different. Fanny Price comes next. That's completely different from anything she'd ever thought of before. Then you've got Emma, who looks a lot like Elizabeth Bennet with a problem, who needs to grow up. And then you get Anne Eliot. Of course, in the last, you got Catherine Morland, who's really ought to come before all of them, but she just didn't get published. Well, I could say it's tokenism. which it kind of is. But I do think it's, an image that we need. It's an image that I know when I teach Jane Austen that I don't have to sell the material. Everybody wants to be there, and most of them have read 2 or 3 or 4, if not all of them, before they get there. And that matters, you know. I actually did, you know, I've taught the Austen Seminar 3 times. I was so pleased with David Martineau. David Martineau was the first male who ever took it. But more ought to, they would learn. Yes? Well, if you look at the Crofts, who are a wonderful comic couple, and watch them drive down the road with Miss Admiral Croft just kind of going, yeah, having a marvelous time, but he's like, you know, he is not somebody that you want to be on the road with. And then you look at Mrs. Croft, who's trying to, you know, just sort of settle him down and sort of keep things rolling, and, you know, I don't see that as the Frederick and Anne marriage model. I know. I think that is a completely open question, and one can speculate all one likes. It's kind of like, you know, the afterlife of Rosalind and things like that. I'm not sure it's completely signaled. It's certainly made as a possibility because of the Crofts model. Eight years is a long time. And luckily, Waterloo happened on land, and it happened quickly. But other questions? Well, thank you all, and if you haven't inspected the window, do inspect it. It's a great thing. I've been trying to work out a time and something appropriate to bring, because my friend Devaney Loser, who told me that this is the only one in the world that I know of, would be delighted to come here. So I hope I'm able to get her to come out here someday. But right now, I think she's on a tour in Bolivia. I mean, who writes a book on Austen and gets invited to Bolivia, you know? Thank you all.